Hello, this is Jared from Commit Quality, and in today's video we're going to go over loops in C#. So C# comes with a few loops. We have the while loop, the do while loop, the for loop. I'm not going to give you an overview of all of them right now. We're going to work through each individual one and talk about the differences so you can see it a working example as we talk through it. So first of all, I just want to create some kind of counter. So I'll just say int number equals, let's say 10 for now. And the first one we talked about was the while loop. So let's go over that first. So this basically says while a condition is true, we'll keep executing the code inside the block. So let's give you a working example before we actually start talking too much about it. We're going to say while. And just like we did with our conditional statements in the last video, I'm going to say while this statement equates to true, we want to do something. So I'll say while number is less than 10, then we want to execute whatever's inside this block of code. So in this case, we'll say console.writeLine number. So we'll just output the number and number plus plus. And this will mean every time this line of code executes, because we're in a loop, but it's going to keep continuously going through, it's going to increase the number by 1. And this is very important. I'll touch on this in a little second. We've said while number, which is 10, oh, Terra will set that to 1 because there's no point, otherwise that won't work. So we'll say while number, which is 1, is less than 10, execute this, and re-repeats, and then you'll check number is equal to 2. While 2 is less than 10, redo it, and it'll keep going through each iteration until this number is 10, and then it'll exit out of the loop and you can carry on with whatever else you have in your lines of code down below. It's worth noting with the while loop, this condition is tested before the loop runs. So only if it's true, it will run. And I'll show you what happens when it's false in a second. But if this was false, none of this works, basically. So let's execute this, and what we'll see is the number is output from 1 to 9, but as soon as it hits false condition, which is basically when the number's 10, it stops working. Amazing. Now, let's just set it to 1 to show while the number is less than 1, and it's not, so this is a false condition here, we shouldn't see anything output, and that's exactly what happens here, no output coming from there. I touched on this number plus plus being really important where we'd increment the number by 1. And if we didn't, maybe you could guess what's going to happen once I set this back to 10. If I say console.writeLine number, this is going to always be true because nothing is increasing. So we get stuck in an infinite loop, which we haven't here because I've done this the wrong way. I've said 1 up here, but this should be 10 because the statement was false. Let's rerun that again. And now we should be stuck, look, in this infinite loop where we constantly just see the number 1. The only way to get out of it is by closing the program. Typically not what you want to do, but you might want in some cases where you might want to say, maybe always output what the date time is. So if I say datetime.now, this is always going to execute. So it's always going to give us an updated version of the time. So here you can see 15, 19, 11 seconds, 12, and it's going to keep doing that all the way through for us. So I guess there's use if you want constant check-in, but typically you don't want to have infinite loops in your code. So definitely check that whatever your condition is here can always equate to false after you've done some iteration. What I do also want to mention as well is just like the if condition video in my previous video, if it's a one-liner, it can look exactly like this and it'll work as expected, or it can be all on the same line as well. If I execute this, you'll see nothing will complain because it's just one line statement inside our block. We don't need the curly braces. So maybe you're starting to see a pattern with these things now is you can start getting rid of certain characters where they're not needed if your code isn't that large. Awesome. So that's the while loop. The main thing to remember on this is the condition inside here is always is tested before the loop runs. So you could say the block of code you had in here may not always execute. It really depends on if this condition is true or not. Our next loop is going to be a little bit different. So let's call it our do while loop. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to write out the code and then explain it, because I think if I talk about it without anything in front of you, it might be a little bit confusing. So we can use the keyword do, and we've got our block of code here, where I'm just going to say console.writeLine number, and we'll say number plus plus because we want to iterate it. But you can see there's an error here, and it's telling us syntax error while is expected. You might have guessed by the name. Do while takes in two keywords. We got do, and then we've got the while, which is going to be our condition. So I'm going to say number less than 1. The difference between this is using a while loop, this wouldn't have executed because number less than 1 up here, which is what we did previously, it didn't execute anything and didn't run. But in this case, it will. And that's because the body of this statement, which is this part inside these squiggly brackets, will execute before the condition is checked. So that means this will always execute at least once. And a good example of this could be for custom web first assertions, where you might want to check if something passes. If it's not, go into this while condition and use your retry behavior. So if I run this, we should see the number 1 output, but then of course, because number was less than 1, it doesn't satisfy this and it should be false. So we should only see 1 output here, and that's exactly what we saw there with 1. Of course, if I increase this to 10, you're going to see similar to what we did before, where we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 9. Perfect. So this one's really good and useful. Like I said, that example where you always want to execute this at least once. You always want to check something, and then you can go into your while and see what happens. Once again, though, you want to make sure you don't fall into that infinite loop, because I could do this, and we're going to fall directly into this infinite loop because we haven't incremented our number. So we've talked a lot about this kind of infinite loop, and the next thing I'm going to talk about should help away with that, and we won't need to directly put inside the body of our code n++ or whatever we wanted to do. So let's comment this out, and let's go over the next loop, which is called a for loop. And this is definitely more common in what you see. You can basically do everything inside your initialization, the condition, and the iterator can all be plumbed into the start of the for loop, and then in the body you only actually worry about the code. So like I said, we talk about not getting into an infinite loop, and that's usually because we forget the iterator that we had here where we said number ++. In a for loop, you have to set an iterator. So it's kind of like a catch for us there, so we don't get into that kind of nasty cycle. So let's write something up and talk about it. We've got for here, so I'm going to say for int n, which is going to be our number. We'll set that to 1. So you're doing your initialization in here. I'm then going to say if n is less than 10, do something. And like I said, you have to pass through your iterator. In this case, I'm going to say n++. So what I can do inside the body now is only worry about this console.writeLine. Now, of course, it's not going to be number anymore. It's going to be n because this is the new setup we're using. So just to go through it, n replaces what we did outside of our while loop here. So that's number. Our condition here is what we've wrote inside the while. And the iterator is inside the for loop. So if I execute this, what we should see is 1 to 9 again, exactly like we saw in the do while. Perfect. You can start playing around with these to see how things will work. Like I said, you've got that date time. You can see how you can make an infinite loop, how you possibly would get out of it. Kind of just mess around with different exercises. Before we end this off, I want to give a nice little tip as well about a couple of keywords we can use inside loops which can stop execution completely or skip an iteration. So when we talk about iterations, we say an iteration was n starts at 1, it output 1, then it goes through the loop again, and it goes to 2, 3, 4, and each of those are individual iterations. What we could do is add a condition into here. We could say if n is equal to 2, maybe we want to say, right, let's do a console.writeLine saying you found magic number 2. And if you want to skip the iteration for when the condition of n equals 2, we could add this keyword of continue. Now what this will do is means we should see 1, then the next iteration will say you found the magic number 2, and then it'll keep going over saying 3, 4, 5, and it won't, when it hits number 2, it won't hit this console.writeLine of n, which was just output in 2, because we've said skip the iteration as soon as this condition has been met. So if we run it, you can see here, 2 is not output. Instead, we had this, you found the magic number, and it's halted any of the extra execution inside this for loop. That's how you can use the continue keyword. But you can also say break. And the difference between continue and break means continue, you carry on with the loop, you just skip that iteration. But this one, it's going to halt everything. As soon as n equals 2, we're going to close the for loop and get out of it. And there we are, we've hit 1, and then as soon as we hit 2, we output you found the magic number, and then we broke out of the loop. I thought that's really cool to show, because you might want to play around with things like this and say, okay, maybe use an input, guess a number, and you keep inputting a number, it'll keep going through the for loop until it hits the number, and then you can break out, and you can obviously output saying, you found the magic number, well done. Very simple text-based game, but something really useful that could help you learn conditionals and the loops that we've been talking about. And that's really it. As always, any questions or comments, please drop them down below. If you do try an exercise and you can't get it to work, explain what you're doing in the comments, and hopefully myself or anyone else from the community watching the video will be able to help you with the challenge you set for yourself. If you are finding my content useful, a like and subscribe is appreciated. I've also enabled super thanks so you can help contribute to the videos and my website and everything else. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a good day.